Hey, you know how sometimes it's always one of those things? Well, this is definitely one of those things. This week's episode got eaten by my computer when I was most of the way in. And since it's Thanksgiving and I have all these things staring at me, I decided instead of doing myself in, I thought, hey, let's bring back that turkey episode. But first, a toast from this book of 1901 toasts I found in the history pile. May your injuries be always written in sand, but your friendships always written in marble. Here we go. The first thing to know is that what we call turkeys, those more or less giant chickens we seem to feel a national need to consume once or twice a year, are entirely American birds. And yet we, like most of the rest of the world, call them by a name of a country they are not from. So the bird we currently know is turkey, what was called turkey fowl by the 17th century British colonists, and inhabits much of Europe as a domesticated farm bird. They all came from a population of southern Mexican birds imported by the Spanish in the 16th century. These birds definitely came from away. They were exotic and exciting. They were basically the sriracha chili garlic sauce of their day. And like sriracha, the turkey has a name that ties it to a geographical location that doesn't really make sense with its cultural and locational history. But no one wants your, well, actually. A good story is a good story, and good stories are what most people prefer. How widespread is the good story versus the boring facts? Let's take a tour of what the rest of the world calls this North American native, Meleagris gallopavo, which incidentally is one of those scientific names that crams together nonsense. This one unwinds to guinea fowl, rooster, peacock. That's right up there with the giraffe name that unfolds to camel leopard. And before I get any further, a quick correction. I implied that turkeys were native all the way down into South America. Not so. The range of the wild bird only extends to the south end of North America, with populations on either side of the Sierras in Mexico. Oh, and there's a really cool looking iridescent ocellated turkey with a turquoise blue head that lives on the Baja Peninsula. Anyway, the Spanish. They started the whole mess in the 16th century by bringing back these more or less giant chickens and calling them effectively Indian bird, which was very in line with the court fabulists and troubadours insisting that Ferdinand and Isabella had sponsored a successful voyage to the Indies. After all, that sailor madman had brought back Indians. Then the Portuguese, who were also messing about in South and Central America but had better geography. They were certainly not above visiting the southern reaches of North America. They seem to have also found reasons to get their own domestic flocks going. For whatever reason, they were closer to the mark in naming conventions. They called the birds Peru. Portuguese sailors took the birds with them as a source of fresh meat and eggs on board their ships. If you remember from early episodes where Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator's boat lab was leading the way in European exploration, you won't be surprised to learn that Portuguese sailors appear to be responsible for the spread of several global food trends, including tomatoes, corn, peanuts, and sesame seeds. In that vein, they seem to have also had a hand in spreading the Peru, to India, where it continues to go by that name in parts of the country to this day. Just to keep things interesting, in other parts of India where the Portuguese did not range, it goes by the name Turkey. Then, for a series of reasons, just about everywhere to the north and west of India called the bird by some version of the words India fowl, India bird, Indian chicken. In much of Eastern Europe, the names are generally things like Indiushka, Indik, and in France, it's known as dinde, which is a laundering of poulet dinde or coq dinde. And I know you are dying to know, what about in Turkey, the country? It's called Hindi. Now, the Dutch, who were right on the heels of the Portuguese and trading in India and the Malay archipelago for spices, call the bird kalkun, or hen from Calicut, or kolikot. In the Baltic states, like Denmark, that traded heavily with the Dutch, they also have names that are basically kolikot hen, or bird. But in areas around Oceania, where the Dutch were heavily buying, trading for, and establishing plantations of spices after they moved past kolikot, it's called the Dutch chicken. Macedonians call it the Egypt bird, and while some Arabic-speaking countries call it the Roman chicken, other Arabic-speaking countries name it Ethiopia bird. This, frankly, is one of the more sensible wrong names. A hen turkey and a guinea fowl, a similarly sized speckled bird found all over sub-Saharan Africa, these two look remarkably similar. A few languages care not at all for the origin of the bird, but rather focus on the sound it makes. The area that was to become Germany was not particularly involved in the sea trade in the 16th and 17th centuries. They went with the name truthen or truthen, which referenced the general sound the birds make about the farmyard. But I have to give the Persians the onomatopoeia award. They call it the bugalamun. Turkeys as a domesticated farmyard animal can be found in just about any country in the world, yet not a single one has a name that correctly acknowledges its North American origins. Peru is as close as it gets. While turkeys did make a splash in Europe and Central and Western Asia, they made much less headway in East Asia, where there were already strong chicken and waterfowl keeping traditions before the arrival of the turkey. Turkeys are to be found, but not generally, because unlike the long domesticated varieties of other farmyard birds, turkeys are fast and can be rather ornery. Regardless, every single place the turkey arrived, it was seen as an exotic foreign bird. But what to call it ended up being mostly about what the local byword for exotic was at the time, rather than any reference to its true origin, which is how we end up with turkey being the name in England. In the 16th century, the peacocks and guinea fowl were both fancy imported birds in England, and at that point, if something was exotic, exciting, and otherwise strange, they were attributed to the current land of all things exotic, exciting, and strange, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, or Turkey. There are apparently references to peacocks and guinea fowl being referred to as turkey fowl before the arrival of our bird. But this was a specific reference to them being the merchandise of those exotic turkey merchants. And remember that corn, for a hot second, had been referred to as turkey wheat before it became the just as incorrectly named Indian corn? So somewhere in the intersection of these birds being from exotic foreign parts, looking a bit like guinea fowl, the name turkey fowl, or turkey for short, ended up sticking. Now, there's a raging debate with offshoots and alternate theories, at least in some research circles, about which is the real source. But I'm more of the opinion that, 1, like most popular naming conventions, it's a little from column A and a little from column B, And 2, without a time machine, this, like a few other words I've explored, is unknowable. And pinning down the moment is much less important than having a general sense of all the things going on that made this rather kooky outcome possible. So those first turkeys the Spanish brought back, were they wild turkeys or were they already domesticated? Domesticated. In fact, research done on a few archaeological sites in Mexico and the American Southwest show that there were definitely at least 2 different areas where turkeys were domesticated and kept as a village food source. The 2 turkey populations and the domestication events were entirely independent. In what would become the U.S., turkey domestication took place in the area where we can still see pueblos and the Cliff Rock cities, what is generally known as the Four Corners area, and was home to the Diné or Navajo, Hopi, Ute, and Zuni people when the Spanish arrived in the 16th century. Despite being divided up and reassigned when the U.S. created modern Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, some of this land is still home to the descendants of those tribes. Once you learn that this land is also the home to some of the longest continuously farmed land in North America, the fact that it was the site of domestication of pre-contact North American animals is no longer a surprise. Turkeys were domesticated there somewhere between 200 BCE and 500 CE. Then when you make the connection that turkey domestication and the arrival of corn farming from Mesoamerica overlapped, it actually makes a lot of sense. As populations became more agriculture-focused, they figured out ways to decrease their reliance on hunting to access meat. Incidentally, while wild turkeys are still to be found in this area, the domestic population left no clear descendants. The other documented domesticated turkey populations were in Mexico, right where the Spanish washed up on its eastern shore. Turkey domestication seems to have started in what is now southern Mexico, sometime between 800 and 200 BCE. Both the Mayan and Aztec civilizations kept turkeys, ate them in complex stews, steamed tamales, and other dishes. They used turkey feathers and bones in both decorative and functional ways, including tools, instruments, and warm and stunning feather cloaks, tapestries, and regalia. These southern Mexican domesticated turkeys were from entirely different populations than their northern cousins. And it was these southern Mexican turkeys that were the progenitors of all the recognized domestic turkeys in the U.S., Europe, and anywhere turkeys are farmed. Even the heritage breeds farmed today in the U.S. are descendants of those Mexican turkeys. They were imported into Europe, further bred there, and then re-imported into the U.S. in the 17th and 18th centuries. There are still wild turkeys in North America, in the U.S. and Mexico. But the U.S. wild turkeys are a different animal from the domesticated turkeys. There's further confusion because in some areas, the U.S. wild turkeys were basically hunted to extinction in waves. First along the East Coast, much like with the deer. At first, it seemed there were so many, they could never be eaten all up. But as flintlocks appeared at the end of the century, and then later cartridge rifles, traditional hunting lands were turned into farms, and hunting seasons were ignored. The New England, Virginia, and Carolina turkey flocks went the way of the deer herds, dwindled to almost nothing, and became pretty insignificant as wild birds. As colonial populations later turned into frontier populations, they had a habit of serially consuming wild game populations as they arrived, established homesteads and towns. And in this way, they cleaned out much of the wild turkey population. These birds were large, were easy to hit, and could simply be caught sleeping on branches reasonably close to the ground. Turkeys, both wild and domesticated, are not great flyers. As with other animals, 19th century railroads caused people to get all crafty with the introduction and reintroduction schemes of different animals in different places. There's a wild story of an ill-advised and doomed attempt to introduce eels to the West Coast at the end of the 19th century. I'll put a link in the show notes. But the turkey schemes were much less fraught. They were reintroduced into some areas as a food source during the Depression. Later, when conservation efforts became popular as a way of restoring both land and hunting prospects, other places also moved around populations to bring back the turkey. The reintroduction was usually successful, non-disruptive, and generally helpful for grassland and forest health, since the turkeys had long been part of the landscapes and the biosphere. What's important about all that old turkey reintroduction now is that when turkeys are tested with modern-age DNA methods to determine subpopulations, the traits are all scrambled, and it makes nonsense of any attempt to sort and place them in any sort of map of pre-contact subpopulations. Mexican turkeys were less scrambled, so subpopulations still exist, and those wild turkeys from the first millennium BCE that were domesticated and then taken to Europe in the 16th century, their descendants are still wandering the grasslands and forest edges of Mexico, eating bugs, grass, acorns, and pinyon seeds. Oh, and just one other little thing. What were those turkeys called when they were at home? There were probably lots of names. In fact, there are still lots of names where Native American tribes in the U.S. and Mexico continue to live with and eat turkeys. But the domesticated southern Mexican turkeys that the Spanish took back to Europe, the recorded name we have is guajolote or huajolote from the Nahuatl or Aztec name. So that's the pre-colonial past. Turkey establishment in North America and the world over. Now on to the second part of my story. Why, if all the advertising said the New England colonies were practically overrun with deer and covered in birds, including wild turkeys, did the early colonists, the Massachusetts Bay Colony specifically, in 1629 import domesticated turkeys from England? As I may have mentioned before, unlike the later colonists and then the early Americans who started carving out homesteads and farms, those early colonists were terrible at hunting. By the 16th century, the only people that hunted in England were the large landowners, which pretty much meant royalty and nobility and some poachers. Most people did not hunt. Peasants didn't officially hunt, and city people, most of the people who were the early colonists, definitely didn't hunt. A few soldiers and military men had access to and practice with firearms, but as I mentioned earlier, these firearms were pretty terrible for hunting. Back in England in the 17th century, hunting with bow and arrow and the spear were far more common, and largely the province of someone who had a relationship with an armorer. The majority of the early colonists in New England were neither noble nor military, Miles Standish definitely excepted. They knew they would have to purchase or raise most of their meat, which is what absolutely happened. Chickens came over very early, but as I mentioned before, they were scrawny. So in order to alleviate the scrawny chicken problem, the turkey, or basically giant chicken, was imported into the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1629. People knew that wild turkeys abounded, but they had to be brought down. They were fast and ornery. One could seek out wild turkeys where they slept at night and literally throw a bag over them. But no good Puritan Christian wanted to be known as someone who wandered about the woods at night. Please reference the fate of poor Goody Proctor. Also, wolves and wildcats and weasels and bears. Oh my. So to simplify the capture and eating of poultry, the domestic turkey was brought over. In the end, the joke was on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. the local wild turkey population interbred with their imported, tamer, domesticated turkeys, making them wild and fast and ornery. So later colonial residents kept importing calmer domestic turkeys, which means this is at least the third animal the colonists imported, which then went feral on them. While good farmers with at least a reasonable relationship with the land and the local animals seemed to be able to domesticate animals, the early American colonists have caused first pigs, then cows, and now turkeys to go feral. In case you're wondering, they're not done with this trend. And that's where I'll leave us. In the 17th century, despite plenty of wild turkeys, most of the turkeys the early colonists ate were imported, domesticated turkeys. Wild turkey consumption would only pick up in the 18th century with the simpler-to-master firearms. 17th century colonists rarely took up the bow and spear since they were, first, out of reach as older military weapons due to skill in making and use, and because the spear and the bow and arrow marked the user as a New World savage. Hard as it is to believe, we are reaching the end of the 17th century. Other than spices, which I will get to, I have covered every major food category and cooking tradition the British colonists brought with them. It is certainly not an exhaustive list, and the very richest people certainly had a few things and traditions I didn't cover. I did that either because such things were either super obscure and generally useless to the general populace, think whatever the most extreme version of like a gold leaf top truffle burger stuffed with, I don't know, pearls would be, or had really no particular influence on the development of what exists as American food. There are still a few categories to cover, especially New World specific stuff, and a look at the labor situation.